Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Benedito Ferrão, a professor of English and Asian and Pacific Island American Studies at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, USA. And I'm currently also a fellow of the American Institute of Indian Studies, and I'm located presently at the Xavier Center of Historical Research in Goa. It's my great pleasure today to be in conversation with my friend and the poet Priscilla Wathington. And before I introduce her, I'd just like to say thanks so much to the folks at 1455 for putting together this festival and being open to this conversation, which I'm really happy to be able to share with the audience. So just a brief introduction of Priscilla, who will also be reading some poems from her new chapbook. She'll share those with us today. So Priscilla Wathington is a Palestinian American poet and editor who has worked with NGOs such as the Arab American Action Network, Defense for Children International Palestine, and the Norwegian Refugee Council. The poems in her debut book, Paper and Stick, comes out from Tram Editions, or came out earlier, came out in 2021. And according to Dima Shahabi, sharply probe the way language both limbs and shadows atrocities. Wathington's poems have appeared in Gulf Coast, Michigan Quarterly Review, Salamander, The Normal School, Mizna, and elsewhere. She holds a master's in Arab Studies from Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and sits on the board of the Radius of Arab American Writers, or Rowi. Welcome, Priscilla.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be a part of this.
Thank you for agreeing to do this with me. And I wanted to start by asking you about just sort of like, what's your earliest memory of writing poetry? And creatively, is it a form that you turn to because you find that it allows you to express yourself in a particular kind of way?
Yeah. So I'm sure that I wrote those kinds of poems that we do early on in grade school. I grew up mostly in Jerusalem and I attended this British international school. So I'm sure we did some things like limericks and acrostics and that sort of thing. But the first time that I sort of remember going to poetry, on my own was after I'd gone on this hike. It's a strange sort of memory to pull up, but I'd gone on this hike with my family and some other friends, and it was outside of Jericho. And there were these really beautiful sort of sand cliffs with sort of like clay lines in them. And I remember being just really mesmerized by these views and having this kind of dream, waking dream like experience where you're just so entranced and so mesmerized, this kind of ecstatic internal experience, and sort of looking around at my friends and seeing like it wasn't translating for them. They weren't in the same experience. And it's like a first sort of moment of reckoning, like this thing had happened inside me and it was big, and nobody else was in this dream moment with me. And so when I went home, I wanted to do something to kind of preserve the experience or to make sense of it. And I ended up writing a poem. And I suppose it's probably because I'm really, really terrible at drawing. So I didn't have a way to like visually recapture the experience. And so I went to, paper, and that's where it began. It was, I think, fairly sure it was a horrible poem called something like, My World, and super rhymey and super sing-songy, but it was a beginning. And yeah, the more that I've sort of gotten into poetry, the more that I've really found myself in it and found more and more of the world in it. When you ask about like, what is it that's so interesting or exciting about this creative form, I think for me, it has to do with all of its possibilities. You can use poetry as a way of telling a story, the narrative poem, of course, and memorializing personal history or communal history or something sacred to you. But poems can just as easily be a form of abstraction, or like, let's say, a study of something, even a study of language. They can be commentary. They can hold superlinear rationalities, and they can also hold, its opposite. They can take you on a completely dizzying experience, like one of those carnival rides where you can't see anymore and you can't find your way. So yeah, all of that really speaks to me. And I suppose it's also the fact that it's this very egalitarian form as well, just like with the way that I came to poetry. I don't think I would have done it if I needed a lot of supplies at the beginning or a lot of investments. I love that it's something that anybody can do, as long as you have something to write with and something to say.
Thanks for that. That's actually very revealing and kind of touching as well. I love this sort of like image of you as a young poet, and I'm sure that the piece, even though you remember it as not being that great, I'm sure that it had inklings of what was to be revealed to the world. So that's really cool. Thank you for that. But so apart from the poetic form, and we will certainly return to that, it sounds to me like from the work that you've done in the past, that you've obviously explored other genre of writing, and particularly with your work with Defense for Children International Palestine and other NGOs that you've worked for. If you could tell us a little bit more about other genre of writing that you've done, and then also perhaps how that and your work itself has come into your poetry. So this sort of like, in a way, cross-genre kind of writing maybe, but then also just basically the experience of writing in different forms, and then really the inspiration behind your work, which you'll also be sharing with us, I guess.
Yeah, I love this question about what other kinds of forms are there, beyond sort of what we think of as poetic forms. Because there's so many, right? For me, one of the forms that was common was, the official report, something that many NGOs need to take up, many human rights groups. And of course, those can also have different shapes, like, a UN submission, official report, or like, end of year report, or but it certainly is its own genre, right? If it's in a humanitarian context, it's going to have these sort of rules, like you're going to weight down the beginning and the end with your largest, most significant claims. You're going to put your recommendations at the end. They're going to be law forward. There were, I guess I'm mixing up the two questions, but I'll stay on the question of form for a second, and then I'll try to get to all the rest. There were a lot of other forms that we worked on. Sometimes they were forms that like we had invented ourselves, and that were sort of specific to the organization, and others are probably forms that many other places would use. But there's, like if you take the op-ed, that's a particular style of logical flow and argument. There's a particular kind of leniency with language, maybe even over-the-top metaphors that you could use in that. Whereas if you're doing something like a diplomatic brief, you're going to have completely different constraints around how your language has to be, and how sort of compact and how brief everything has to be. So I guess a way to say it is that every one of these forms had its own set of rules that you had to learn. And they did help me think about these kinds of, I guess, craft questions about like pacing or about density, because each of these forms would have a rule around what's the beginning. Is it the past, what we might call context, or is it the present moment? Does everything have to happen simultaneously, that who, what, when, where, why of journalism? Or should it be sort of leaked out slowly? What counts as sort of like really compelling content in that form? Is it something like numbers and big data, or is it something like a really juicy quote, Or, is it something like your own narrative, the author's inserted analysis? And then that question of like density, what is the ratio of, if ideas is one axis, then the other axis would be like, pace of words, how many words per idea. And that has to do with your idea of how much the audience is going to read and what's their patience. And so, yeah, all of these things kind of are, axes for thinking about writing in general, that I'm sure have really found their way into my poetry. Certainly there's, direct sort of humanitarian language or legal language, right into the body of the poems themselves. And then for that second part of the question, like, how did this sort of influence my work, my poetry work, I should say? I think beyond the forms and beyond the very obvious connection of like the content itself, I think it really influenced me because of the high volume of production. So sort of toward that writing habit thing, when you're paid to write, instead of sort of like the way I was writing poetry as something on the side, when you're doing writing as work, you get a lot less shy about that blank page, because it becomes a really, practical issue, right? Words become like, rice and lentils or bread and butter. You just sort of get over yourself a bit. You have to produce with more like a crank than, this feather of slow care. And I think that was quite helpful, because a lot of the writing habit has to do with just showing up and doing something. And so I think that was really, really, really useful. And I guess the final thing I would say is something around the idea of investigation. So when I was working at Defense for Children International Palestine, or for short DCIP, which is a human rights group for children in Palestine, if you're unaware of it, you're playing this role that's sort of between the state and the news. You are in some ways fact-checking the news, in some ways fact-checking the state. You're working on things that are like reporting lines towards the UN, but you're also sort of going out and collecting evidence and trying to carry out your own analysis to figure out if something is about to happen somewhere, if there's cues that an area is becoming really vulnerable, or an issue is happening that's kind of, not getting any coverage or being ignored. And so this sort of investigative bent, this not assuming that the way things are given to you or are produced is true, is actually the whole story, is something that I think has become really prominent in my poetry. This idea of searching and of looking underneath and behind and around the thing. And I think that's something that's probably going to, stay central, because it was very formative for me. At least I hope it seems central and stays central.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I was, also reflecting on how I could actually even ask you the question in reverse. So rather than it just being about the documents that influence your not documents, the documents that you write that is influencing your poetry, that possibly poetry itself came to influence your writing, perhaps, because very often I look for the poetic in various places, and I find that folks who write in multiple genre, they take something from one to the other and bring something from the other to the thing that might be, a very unexpected place where poetry can still work.
Oh yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Because, people who are writing in this kind of international law space or like legal briefs are not necessarily paying attention to like a soundscape, right? Or those kind of illogical aspects of language and how they're working out. So I definitely pushed the envelope at times, and I definitely had like some arguments and and moments where I was like really trying to hold on to one word. I was like, please, I need this word. Don't edit it out. Don't, flatten it. It's doing a lot of work here. So I think that's absolutely true, that the poetry was also feeding my other kinds of work, that it wasn't just one directional, I should say. And I think that especially became true as we were doing more multimedia work, because then sound comes in and image comes in. And that was really exciting as well, because you can maybe be thinking about how an image of a house has something to do with a story, so I didn't do, I never became like an actual filmmaker. I was always sort of a person, offering advice or sort of coming up with the vision, but not, actually the filmmaker. But that was a really exciting and beautiful way of working, which definitely had something to do with poetry brain, as I call it.
No, I think that there's something unique in your writing of poetry that certainly encapsulates some of your formal career experience for sure, but then also I think your lived experience as somebody who spent a great deal of time in Palestine. I mean, you began by telling us about your youth there, and that certainly, probably is a big part of your writing today, even, much after that initial time that you spent there, because you've continued to return and so on. And, this brings me to the question of, apart from the more official role you've played as, a reporter of events, in a sense, the goings on in Palestine in an official capacity, what about life? Do you find that life in Palestine itself, as it comes to you from either being there or reading about it, how I'd like to hear more, and I'm sure our audience would as well, about how that influences your poetry. And then speaking personally for me, I mean, I remember, so as somebody who's a scholar of, coloniality and post-coloniality, I thought I'd read and heard it all until I actually got to Palestine and go, whoa, this is a colony in action, right? Going through checkpoints with Palestinians, especially in a place like Hebron, where, I was just shocked at the daily violence that folks encounter. And it may not always be a very obvious form of violence. It may not always be, sometimes it is, a gun in someone's face, but just the kind of humiliations of going through checkpoints to go to a place where you live, right? You could tell us maybe a little bit about that. And then perhaps also just because you worked quite a bit with various documents, and that's certainly part of the title of your book, right? Paper and Stick. So I guess just to summarize, basically, like, how do you live to experience the experience on the ground, and then dealing with documents and official sorts of things, how does that work into your poetry in various ways?
Yeah, it's so hard to have a good perspective on your own work sometimes, and a great question. So I guess my lived experience is maybe what made my book resist being a completely bounded, sort of like what one might call like a project book, like a book that has a really clear concept that kind of goes the whole way around it, and there's no other openings, sort of that room for like what one might call miscellany. So I think, I have a poem in here called Dance White Boy in the Desert, for example, which, if I kind of totally approached writing poetry through the lens of DCIP, through the lens of sort of research and of laws, and, I think a poem like that wouldn't have ended up inside, because it has to do with individual moments and memories and strangenesses that I'm trying to encapsulate. It's a funny poem to begin reading, and I was going to read more later, but if you wouldn't mind, I'll read this one to give the audience a sense of like why on first glance you would say, what does this have to do with the paper empire? Okay, this one is called Dance White Boy in the Sinai, and it's a short one. Dance white boy in the Sinai, beach towel for a headdress. Sing like only Moses is listening. Let that college football brawn catch Sadat's light. No wall can keep me from you, he whispers from Scout's sleeping bag. White boy, you were telling the truth. So, when you sort of look at this poem on its surface, you would say, well, why is this about, the paper and stick? Why is it about sort of documents? But it has to do with this world and with the importance of the feminine, with the individual experience, sort of jutting into this world, with the idea of who has permission to imagine what, or remember what, or move where. So yeah, I think that's an example, maybe not a very complete answer, but an example of how personal life and memory and my own, feelings and experiences with different sorts of tourists and different sorts of, international folks there rings through into these moments as well. And then for the other part of your question, where you were asking about, the documents and how they're figuring in to the poems as well, I think some people might say like, oh, this is a book about military detention, but to me, it's much more about the document violence, about how absolutely central these documents are to Palestinian life and to one's ability to navigate, to move. I think we wrote in our description something like to articulate their own existence. And it's just absolutely true. Documents control every aspect of Palestinian life, whether it's about trying to get your birth registered, or if you're going to marry somebody and they're from a different area and you need to figure out how you're going to live in the same location. It has to do with medical care if you're living in Gaza, right? It has to do, like you said, with checkpoints and who has permission to go to which place, when, and it has to do with, which religion you are a member of, which days you could travel. It's all tied up in these documents, what you can build when, if we think about what's happening right now in Masafiriyata, which is, you mentioned Hebron, and Masafiriyata is in the South Hebron Hills area in the West Bank, where there's 1,000 Palestinians right now who are at risk of immediate expulsion. And again, this has to do with these military documents. It's a mixed bureaucratic military regime which sort of reproduces itself within this sort of closed circuit of logic, where the military takes an action, the military can write the law that says the action is okay to do and legal, and then what's your recourse, right? If you disobey this law, then you become in conflict with the law, you become vulnerable to military arrest and then to military court procedures, which are themselves produced through documents, right? So your whole life is bounded by this kind of military logic. But when we think about military logic, we just think about the weapons part and the assault part. But through this sort of pairing of a military bureaucracy and the military actions themselves, you can kind of create a system of complete control, right? Where there's no escape. So like in Masafiriyata, one day your land is your land and one day it's the military's land. And if the military decides that it wants to do military things like practice military rule and practice shooting, then they can just create an order saying that's what they're going to do. And if you disagree, you can take it to the courts. So there's no real mechanism to escape these kinds of decisions, besides something like international attention, right, which is very meager and very difficult to come by. And so, we see this happening right from 1948, and, we see it happening again in 1967, and of course, becoming this sort of permanent, state of emergency that everyone is living under. One of the poems I have has to do with Military Order 101, which is about what kinds of assembly and speech are permitted. And, it just sort of demonstrates how widespread, how pervasive and how intrusive these laws are on people's ability to carry out a normal life. Yeah, and if it's okay, I would love to read some poems that, in a poetic way, speak on all of this.
Please do.
So I'll begin with one called Terms. Terms will be found faultless, events ahead of their happenings, the conditions not to impinge on the terms, and their exclusions, all mutual. By extension, we agree how will be punished for departures, fits of fancy, emulsions with soil, access to and use conditioned on your indemnity, some kind of prophecy, fire, floodgate, act of God. So I'll go now to order number 101, that poem I was mentioning. The other name for order 101 in under official military law is the order regarding prohibition of incitement and hostile propaganda actions. Print, blown up the front door and printing, including lithography, Captain Aziz on the phone, that my mouth would get stuck to the wall, writing on a typewriter. Duplication, photography, recording, filming, and sat a dog on my feet. I saw everything, any other way to describe or copy words, literature, as a human shield. Signs were too tight, pictures, maps, drawings, decorations, films, voices, sounds, similar to the door of a safe and other such material. So in that poem, there's two voices. I know it's a little bit hard to hear without seeing it, but one of the voices is actually the text from the military order, and the other voice is these sort of fragments from a previously detained Palestinian youth. So yeah, I wanted them to kind of be in conversation with each other. This one military order, like just sort of outlining every kind of language that could be deemed, problematic by military, and on the other hand, you have this person being treated horribly, with no real recourse, right? Yeah. There was one more I was going to read before we go to your questions.
Yeah.
That's all right. It's also to do with this world of documents, but a different kind of document this time. This document that I came across was an article. It was written by Yamin Roman and it was called the Names Committee. And I sort of came upon it while I was doing research for a Norwegian Refugee Council report that I was a consultant for and working on. And we were looking at attacks on education with special attention toward the Palestinian communities living in living in Area C, who were mostly Bedouin, and the kinds of challenges they were facing with their schools as Israel kept demolishing or placing stop work orders on the schools. So I came across this article, which is to do with the taking of the Negev. And also mixed in is a few lines from a more recent article by Barak Ravid, which was called in Arabic and in Hebrew, "A Name is More Than Just a Name." Flag the moon. A decision to conquer the Negev this year. A spontaneous choir. Make desolate riverbeds, mountains, geographic features, bloom the general under the ancient tree, the just finished armistice, name El-Quds beside it, in parenthesis, someone played the harmonica, a bath of light over Jordan whose meaning unclear, 3 British destroyers anchored, spiritual ownership, the names, Ain Wa'iba today, Ain Yahav, Wadi Jarafi today, Paran, explorers nominated, geographers, archaeologists, an official committee to bestow, not every wadi or jabal worthy of translation. There was no place called Eilat. Ras al-Masri marked the border, Egypt. But the Bedouins do have names for them. Ma'ale in Hebrew, or a pass, Ma'avar in Hebrew. Some for totally obliterating the name Melebs. The way to Netanya must read Hulud. The only connection between the public works signs pointing to Petah Tikva, these 2 names, the same sound. Utilize its economic. A small adobe hut, Rash, the big shopping mall of Eilat. Turned some laqabs into a sense. Nobody knows today where Wadi Jirafi, El Birin. So I'll hold off on reading more poems there.
That was really beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing those. I think, you know, I've of course heard you read your poems before and read them myself, but there's something that comes across quite differently when the poet themselves are reading their work. And so it's moving, but I also get a sense of how your poetry works to kind of you know, capture you know, precisely what I was asking in the question, moments and history, and then also this interplay of documents. And it strikes me, particularly in hearing you read these today, that in as much as, and I love what you do where you actually, you know, like with the poem where you've got pieces of documents that form that conversation, where you actually take from official documents and you know, encode them in the poem in a sense, right, and create something more out of it. But in as much as you are using documents, your poetry itself is documenting. And particularly with this history of names and their erasure, I think that's so important because it is a record. You're creating a poetic chronicle of names that are so easily forgotten or wiped out, thanks to the official recording of a new name or the instantiation of a new name. But just because you know, the official document has done that, it doesn't mean it's disappeared. It's in the memory. It's in the passing on of these names. And in a sense, I feel like, particularly the poem you just read, it's almost working like an oral history.
Yeah.
In both documenting an oral history and then functioning as an oral history. So I really appreciate that. Really
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, when I came across this article, which was just so blatant. It was, it was shocking. It's like almost I don't want to say it was a trauma because I'm just here reading, but like it was so horrifying to hear about this kind of the performance of it, right? Having I don't know if it all comes across through the erasure, but having the general pose beside an old tree as you work on rewriting the names. I mean, it's so unrepentant, right? So yeah, poetry becomes almost like a kind of therapy of handling what's happened. And also, as you said, of resistance, of documenting, and of sort of girding up ourselves, our courage, our memory, as we have to keep going.
No, but I think what you're saying is also something that I see quite a bit in colonial and post-colonial literature of the stance of the metropolitan power working from a distance and exacting its power in these ways, right? So the renaming of a place, it's a power move, obviously, right? Just learning, for example, when I went to Jerusalem, that of course, Jerusalem is the name that folks might use to refer to the place they live in, but just the beauty of hearing folks say Al-Quds and seeing that in various places like Al-Quds University and so on, that it does something different. The language and the work it does for people for whom that expresses something where it's not just the name, but it's actually a record of memory and history, right? And the relationship with people, I think is such a powerful thing, really.
Yeah, if it wasn't powerful, there would have been no naming committee working to remove the name, right? Right. And that committee is constantly at work, right? Yeah. So, I mean, this brings to mind another question I wanted to ask you, which is about, I guess intentionality and audience, and more specifically, like as you're writing, do you already have an audience in mind, or like is that something that's just sort of like more diffuse for you? And regardless of what that audience may be, who are you when you're writing this poetry, right? So like, what do you think your role is as the poet writing these poems, regardless of how they might be received? And not to tack on too many questions, but is there, what's the reception of various audiences to your work as well? So if I could ask you those various things about all of this,
intentionality and audience.
Okay. Thank you for all of those questions. I really do appreciate it all, jokes aside. I think when it comes to audience, it's a question we all have and are all asked. It's a question that was very prominent in my other kind of work. I think for me with poetry, the starting thought has to do with this sort of the question of intentions of myself, like you were saying, what I can control and what I can't. So maybe I can't control the audience, who comes and who doesn't, and so maybe it's not worth completely being sure who you're directing it to, or tailoring or narrowing. Maybe it's really comes down to sort of like one of the questions you asked, like my position, my ethical position, and sort of really saying that I'm not writing toward a capitalist logic, right? I'm not writing just for the proof that I've made a thing and I've sold a thing, right? I'm not writing as a means of seeking shelter in something like a coercive, harmful system, right? Writing this book, obviously, about what's happening in Palestine is risky. It brings personal risk to me. And so that's an intentional choice to give up some sense of safety in order to do that. I am also not writing to make a name for myself, so to speak, to become immortal, to carve my name on a tree or something like that. And so those are sort of my intentions that I bring to the practice of writing and to discovery. I'm writing toward changing the current order of things, whether I have the power or the control to do that or not, you know, sort of beside the point, but it's to do with the moving toward the things that we do believe in. And so I think of that as being a kind of conscientious objector, to refuse to enlist in the current order of things and to refuse to participate as much as I can, as much as I know how, in the harm. And I also write, you know, for love. And that might sound trite, but isn't that the beginning of everybody's art in the beginning, right? I write for love, to act toward beauty, toward a different kind of logic, toward a different kind of economy, a different sense of what it means to do something useful. So maybe the audience that comes will be the audience that feels something toward those things, and the audience that doesn't receive it, you know, that's not really in my control, or my wish to control, really, in some sense, right? How have audiences reacted? You know, that's a tough one, because we've been in the pandemic with a lot of Zoom readings, a lot of black squares during the reading. So I'm used to having that feedback, you know, that facial feedback from the audience, where you could kind of see surprise, or you can see dismay, or boredom, or whatever. But I don't have that necessarily a lot of the time now during my readings. You know, I can say that in the past, the context has really defined the reaction, right? Like, when I've been in a mostly white context, there is a really, you know, pre-populated imagination about what an Arab is like, that is constantly present and is very hard to cut through, very hard to exist in that space, you know, where people will read a poem and just hear anger, even if it's a love poem or something. They'll be like, I like the poem, but why is it so angry? You know, why are you screaming? And you're like, I wasn't screaming. So there's this challenge of, you know, the refusal to see and the refusal to hear at times. And then I think in other contexts, you know, there is a sense of recognition, of seeing yourself, of your experience, finding it there. And I hope there is that sideways thing, like where you see yourself, but also you see the world in a slightly shifted way as well. You know, I guess that's what I look for in other people's work, that kind of element of renewal, of surprise, of reorientation, maybe, where you come back to things with a fresh take, and new eyes, new ears.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you're not always going to know who your audience are. And even if you had an intended audience, it doesn't mean that there isn't a future audience awaiting your work down the road as well. So, you know, I think it changes. But what you're saying about who you are when you're writing, I think that's really interesting, about being the conscientious observer. And I think, or sorry, conscientious objector, and perhaps observer as well, right? But that goes back to what I was asking you earlier about, you know, also these poems working as a form of documentation, even as they are an act of resistance, and that certainly comes across. And it got me thinking about, you know, even though you say, you know, you're not looking for fame, or that you're writing for love, I think it is important that, you know, these poems are accessible in a published form. And this is, I think that's one of the difficulties with poetry, because it is a market, and I hate to use that term, but in a sense, a very saturated one, where it is difficult to be published. And so to ask a sort of technical question, I guess, for this book, for the chapbook, did you already have like a body of works that you put together to create this book? Or did you have a theme in mind and then write to that theme? Or was it a blending of the two?
Yeah, I love questions like that because I'm fascinated by these authors that really plan things out and make lists and outlines. And I'm really not that kind of writer. It's very much a kind of discovery for me, where what's going to happen. And it usually happens after there's been some sort of pressure on me, right? Whether it's a positive or a negative pressure. Every time I kind of make a plan to write really clearly towards a narrow thing, I just don't, I can't. So yeah, I mean, the chapbook kind of came about while I was working at DCIP. I was working on 2019 co-authoring a report on solitary confinement of Palestinian children under military arrest with my former colleague, Brad Parker. And so we were looking at Israel's use of isolation in this sort of pre-trial period of detention. And you're kind of seeing these patterns and you're kind of going through all of these children's statements. And, you know, that experience was really common in my line of work, but also, you know, constantly really crushing the individual voices that sort of like haunt you and stay with you. And also like these larger patterns that you keep discovering that are so distressing to know about. And so poetry became, you know, as I'm like working on this report during the day, poetry kind of becomes my outlet in the evening where I go to kind of make sense of it and you know, gather, you know, what I think of as like my unease, collecting all these moments of pressure and trying to put them into something else. And so I had already had at that point a pretty, like a large body of unpublished, uncollected work that I was also trying to put into a manuscript shape. And I wrote a lot of the chapbook sort of just straight. There were a few pieces that I'd written before or that I changed to once I sort of saw what was happening. But yeah, I certainly didn't like start with an idea and then write toward it. And then, you know, honestly, I didn't originally think about chapbooks that much. I was really focused on this idea of the full-length manuscript. But once I began thinking about, you know, a chapbook, I was very enticed by the form, by like the smallness of it, by its sort of guerrilla underground kind of history, and feeling like it might be a really perfect place for this set of poems to live. I mean, if you can see like my hand for reference, it's a really small book, and there's something very dear about this size that, you know, you could put it in your pocket, you could carry it around. It feels very personal, right? This thing of passing things. So that really spoke to me. And I also think that I was very lucky to be allowed to publish with people who would be open to this kind of work in a time where even though we are in a heyday of poetry in many ways, and even though there are many Palestinian American poets these days that are succeeding, it's still a very, you know, taboo topic. There's still a lot of negotiations, and there's still many presses who won't touch that kind of work. So I think the chapbook press is the kind of press that's going to take those type of risks. So that was a big deal to me. And I wanted to honor their interest, as well as the form itself of the chapbook.
And do you know, I mean, this is sort of like an extension of the earlier question I asked you. Have you had any feedback on the book itself? So not asking about, you know, reception from an audience, but actually the book.
Do you mean like during the editing, that like the process with the
no. So like from readers, I guess, readers of the new chapbook paper and stick. Like, has there been any I don't know, have there been reviews? Has there been, you know, feedback from folks you've encountered who've read the book, and, you know, what's that been like?
Reviews are pretty tough with the chapbook. People are really often looking for that full length to do reviews. And I mean, I think in general, reviews are a labor of love, and I've tried to do a number of them, and I would like to do more because it is a way to kind of take part in literary community and sort of give a gift to somebody else. So reception from other people. Yeah, I mean, I think that I guess I'll share personally. I feel that I come across a lot of times as like a very kind of soft, sweet, maternal kind of person. And I think there's an element of surprise when people read my work and it's maybe not so accessible. So I think I get a lot of questions about like, what does it mean? I think that the talks have been a really productive thing because there's a chance for more of a back and forth and conversation about, what I'm at in this book. And I guess, I don't know, I don't mean to be complex. Complexity isn't a kind of like strategy. It's just the nature of my engagement with these things. And so I think that's something I want to think about more of, like when I think about the egalitarianism of the paper and pencil, what happens then when the poem becomes hard to understand, whose responsibility is that? And I don't know if I have an answer for that, but I think that's one of the main kinds of feedback I've gotten from, like, let's say non-poetry readers, but also some poetry readers as well.
Yeah, no, and I think, I also appreciate that in addition to being a writer, you are, you're involved in a writing community, in that you also are a board member of Radius of Arab American Writers Incorporated, or Rowi, of which I'm a proud member as well. So, if you could tell us a little bit about the work that you do with Rowi and about your in, I guess, self-selected community of fellow writers and creators, I guess.
I love Rowi so much. So for people who don't know it, it is like a network of Arab American and Swana writers. It has played a huge role in my life. I joined the board this January, but it's been a part of my life since, I don't know, maybe 2007. And it's just a wonderful, warm community. And I can't imagine having gotten to this point of having a published work without being a part of Rowi, because it has been such a place where I have found friends, I have found like important questions to ask myself, and people to follow, and people who I am like in long conversations with, in even just in my head, like following their work and reading their interviews and like arguing with them in my head, or people that have become my real life, very dear friends. So yeah, it's super important to me. And being on the board has been wonderful because I really do feel indebted to this organization, and I want to be a part of taking care of the organization and sort of paying my dues in that way, and taking care of others as I have been taken care of and fed there. So one thing we have coming out pretty soon, which we're all like just super proud of, is a mentorship program. The community has long been saying that it would be like hugely beneficial. So yeah, we have just sort of finished collecting applications for that and closed that selection process off. And we had something like a little bit under 50 applicants for our very first time doing this. We have 4 mentors on our first round: Trish Salah, Natalie Handel for poetry, Leila Lalami for fiction, and Susan Muaddi Taraj for children's lit. So, and hopefully we'll be able to bring more and more, we'll only have room for about 8 to 12 mentees this time around, but we're hoping that as the program develops over time, that there'll be more and more people able to come through. And just, as one of the ways to kind of address systematic racism that has kind of kept Arabs out of publishing for a long time, and as outsiders to these kinds of institutional conversations about how to make it. So it's not a craft-based mentorship, It's more about just sort of access to an established writer so that they can give you tips and cues about how to go about thinking about things and maneuvering through the landscape. So I'm hoping it'll be a super productive and meaningful experience for everybody.
That sounds wonderful, and the lineup of mentors sounds great.
Yeah.
And I love that you're involved in kind of shaping the next generation of Arab American writers and poets. So it's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's it's a gift, but these institutions don't run on themselves, right? It runs basically all on volunteer labor, and so it's like we all have to take turns, otherwise it won't exist anymore.
No, that's good. That's a fair point.
Yeah.
And that's where a community of writers and creative folks is so important. Absolutely. We don't have a whole lot of time left, so I wanted to ask, what can our audience expect from you next? What are you working on? And perhaps maybe there's a poem you'd like to close out with. I think that'd be lovely.
Sure. Yes. I'm scared now after I said that anytime I try to plan something like a project, I'm not able to do it. So I will tell you, I am working on something new. It's very, very new. And I guess I'll just say it with the caveat that maybe it won't be the project that I'm starting now, but I'm really interested in city design and housing design, in sort of what I see as carceral architecture that a lot of cities are made out of. And I'm also really interested in looking more at the Bay Area, where I live now, and thinking about, who is the city designed for and who is it designed against? And I'm hoping that there'll be ways to kind of speak to both of my contexts, both Palestine and California. It's a really, amorphous, full of possibility state where I'm just sort of beginning to think about all of these things. But I would be happy to end us on a poem that has something to do with all of this. It's actually an already published poem, but I think it's a part of this thing that's developing. It's called "Let This Be the Place." The astroturf lolls over relocated graves. The mall parking atop internment camp. The making of a life, a line of humans to a shark. Your ode to hospitality, not a tent in a sandstorm. A text to the father of your child's foul-mouthed friend. Each day the battle against the inner garden of fireweed, poison berry. Mornings they produce admiration, their verve, nuanceless sheen. Fight the urge to pity the mouse hunting under the oven. Question the question, would it be more? Let this be the place you lay your traps.
That is a powerful way to close out our conversation today. Thank you so much for that, and also for being in conversation with me. And again, to the folks at 1455. Priscilla, it's been a pleasure, as always. And I and the audience look forward to more poetry down the road. So thanks again. And
thank you so much.
To everyone. Bye for now. And if Priscilla, if really quickly you want to say where folks could pick up the book, maybe.
Yes, thank you so much for the honor of being able to participate in this, and for the great pleasure of your company as well. And for anybody interested in picking it up, again, it's paper and stick. And I would love for you to pick it up at Tram Editions. It's actually the only place it's available right now. It's a little brand new press. It's, in fact, this was their very first publication, and it's a chapbook only press. So Tram Editions is where you can order.
Excellent. All right, folks, bye for now. Take care.